April 3rd, 1943. Cape Charles, Virginia. Fog clung to the Atlantic like a second skin, rolling in slow gray waves that swallowed the shoreline and blurred the horizon until sea and sky became a single sheet of dull silver. The wind that morning carried the sharp bite of salt, and the calls of distant gulls echoed like broken notes drifting across the empty beach road. At the far end of the abandoned lighthouse trail, where cracked concrete ran parallel to the churning water, 13-year-old Holly Jensen walked with a slow, almost ritualistic determination. Please subscribe to WWII Never Told German Files to encourage us to bring you more powerful, untold World War II stories. Don't forget to like the video as well. Your support means everything. She held a small box of chalk in one hand, the cardboard soft and warped from days of being stuffed into her coat pocket. Each step carried the weight of memory. The old lighthouse road had been her brother Caleb's favorite spot when he returned home on short leave almost a year earlier. It was where he would kneel in the sand, sketching symbols with a stick and telling her stories about silent communication and the strange hidden languages used by sailors who wanted to speak without speaking. It had been a game then, something simple and innocent, just a brother teaching his sister how to see the world the way he did. But since his ship had been torpedoed 6 months earlier, the path had turned into something else, a place where his ghost seemed to linger, a place where she could pretend he was still near. Holly knelt in the sand, brushing her fingers across the cold, grainy surface. She pulled out a piece of chalk, broke the tip with a small snap, and began drawing the shapes she remembered. Arrows pointing east, 2 joined circles, a triangle split by a line. She did not know what any of them meant. She never had. She only knew Caleb used to draw them with quiet confidence, tapping the shapes with the end of a twig and saying that every mark had a purpose. The fog thickened as she worked. It wrapped the world in silence, softening even the crash of the waves. The chalk scraped faintly against the concrete as she drew a pattern Caleb once made behind their barn, a pattern she had memorized without understanding. 3 circles, a diagonal slash, a dot in the lower corner. She finished the mark and sat back, staring at it as if waiting for some answer to rise up out of the gray air. To the locals, she was simply the strange chalk girl. Children whispered about her at school. Some adults shook their heads when she passed by. They said a girl her age should be playing, laughing, living, not wandering along an empty road, creating a trail of odd symbols that looked more like nonsense than anything meaningful. More than once she heard someone say she was being stupid. But she kept returning anyway. Not for them. Not for sense. For Caleb. The wind pushed the fog inland, revealing a sliver of the ocean beyond the rocks. Holly tightened her coat around her shoulders and moved farther down the road. The chalk danced between her fingers as she drew another symbol. 2 side-by-side arrows. A broken circle. A curve underneath. She paused halfway through the last stroke when the distant rumble of an engine vibrated through the stillness. She turned. A Coast Guard patrol jeep rolled out of the fog, tires crunching over gravel. The vehicle slowed, then stopped abruptly a few feet from her. The doors swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped out with urgency carved across their faces. Their boots hit the ground in quick, synchronized steps. Holly froze, chalk still held between her fingers. The first officer pointed at the symbol on the concrete. He did not look confused. He looked alarmed. Before Holly could speak, both men approached her with tense seriousness. Not anger, but something sharper, something that unsettled her far more. She stood slowly, wiping chalk dust from her hands. One officer crouched beside the symbol, tracing the lines with his gloved fingers. His eyes narrowed. The other officer stared at her, searching her expression as if trying to read the intent behind her drawings. Holly opened her mouth to explain, but the words stuck in her throat. The second officer spoke first, his voice low and controlled. He asked her where she learned to draw symbols like this. Holly hesitated, unsure what to say. She told him she learned them from her brother, who had served as a radioman on a destroyer escort. She told them he drew patterns like these for fun, turning their backyard into a little secret language only they understood. She did not know they were real. She did not know they meant anything. The officers exchanged a look that carried weight she could not decipher. One reached for his radio. The fog muffled his words, but Holly caught enough to understand that something serious was happening. Something far bigger than a girl with chalk and memories. The first officer asked her to follow them. There was no threat in his voice, only urgency. Holly glanced at the symbol again, suddenly feeling as though she had opened a door she was never meant to touch. She stepped forward, heart pounding, as they guided her toward the jeep. They were not arresting her. They were not scolding her. They were afraid. Afraid of the symbols she had drawn. Afraid of what they meant. Afraid of who might be using them, if not her. Because unknown to Holly, the cracked concrete path rested directly beneath a coastal observation tower used by spotters who scanned the horizon for enemy movement. For weeks, coded shapes had been appearing out of nowhere. Signals that looked like childish drawings at first glance, yet matched patterns Navy intelligence had carefully classified. Signals only a trained specialist should recognize. And now a 13-year-old girl had drawn them in broad daylight. The jeep moved slowly through the fog as the officers led her toward the tower perched above the coastline. Holly clutched the chalk box like a lifeline, unaware that her life was about to fracture into something she had never imagined. Halfway up the trail, the static crackle of the officer's radio broke through the silence. A voice cut sharply across the air. The officer stopped walking. His expression changed instantly. The message relayed a U-boat sighting pattern, a specific one, a pattern used only by higher-level Allied cryptographers, a pattern that indicated a submarine traveling at reduced depth due to mechanical strain. The pattern matched the symbol Holly had just drawn. She felt the officer's eyes shift to her again, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to disbelief, and the fog around them felt suddenly heavier. If you are already hooked by what is unfolding here on the cold shores of Cape Charles, then pause for a moment. If you love untold stories from the hidden corners of World War II, remember to like this video, share it, and subscribe to WWII Never Told German Files. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Your location helps us see how far these forgotten stories travel. The officer lowered his radio slowly, the crackle of the message fading into the dense fog. Holly stood between them, still gripping her small box of chalk, the cold wind pushing at her coat, while the officers exchanged glances filled with silent calculations. In that suspended moment, it was as though the entire coastline held its breath. The second officer gently guided Holly forward again, but his earlier confidence had shifted into something tighter, more cautious, as though he now walked beside a puzzle he did not know how to solve. The climb toward the coastal observation tower took them up a narrow wooden staircase, slick with seawater and age. Every step creaked beneath their boots. As they ascended, the fog parted just enough for Holly to see the hazy outline of the water below, a vast gray sheet where anything, a ship, a storm, or a submarine, could hide without being noticed. She shivered not only from the cold, but from the sudden realization that she had stepped into a world far larger than drawings on concrete. At the top of the stairs, the wooden door to the tower's interior swung open. Inside, warm yellow light washed over a cramped room lined with maps pinned to corkboards, binoculars hanging from hooks, and notebooks filled with hastily scrawled entries. A radio hummed in the background. 3 spotters inside turned sharply as the officers entered with Holly. Their expressions flickered from curiosity to unease when they saw the chalk dust smeared across her palms. The first officer asked one of the spotters to bring the logbook. He flipped through pages marked with red pencil strokes until he found the entry he sought. He tapped the lines with his knuckle, then turned the book toward the others. Holly couldn't read it from where she stood, but she saw enough. Her symbols, or something incredibly close to them, repeated across multiple dates. Someone had been leaving messages on the same path for weeks, at night or in the early dawn hours. Messages the spotters believed were part of a hidden communication system signaling German U-boats offshore. Now a girl they had never seen before had drawn the very same code. The second officer crouched beside Holly and asked her to pick up the chalk she dropped earlier. She did. He handed her a blank sheet of paper and asked her, carefully and gently, to draw any other shapes she remembered. Holly hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the chalk tip to the paper. But once she made the first line, the rest came back in a rush. Curved arcs, Dotted markings, twin slashes, symbols she had seen in her mind for months, but never understood. She drew one after the other, the chalk leaving pale streaks across the thick gray paper. The room grew absolutely silent. One of the spotters leaned closer, his brow tightening as he recognized the pattern Holly had unconsciously created, a pattern matching the surfacing cycles U-boats used when recharging their batteries. Each symbol represented timing, depth, or direction. She had memorized them not as strategies of war, but as echoes of her brother's lessons, simple memories of afternoons in the sun. The first officer stood up abruptly, pacing toward the radio. He lifted the receiver and relayed what he was seeing, speaking in clipped low tones. Every man in the tower now understood that the implications were far beyond a curious girl drawing shapes near the lighthouse road. The enemy had been using predictable routes, repeating patterns along the coast that aligned perfectly with the chalk images Holly reproduced. If someone had been signaling U-boats, the messages might not have been random. They could have been part of a larger sequence, one that naval analysts had not fully deciphered. Holly stared down at her chalk-covered fingertips, growing more frightened by the moment. She tried to explain again that Caleb had taught her the markings, that they were simply drawings to her, nothing important. But the room's atmosphere had changed. Every man there now viewed her as an unexpected key to a lock they had been unable to open. The radio crackled again, static, then a sharp voice. The officer straightened. A Navy intelligence team was being dispatched from Norfolk. Within the hour, the spotters exchanged worried looks. The arrival of Navy intelligence meant this was no longer a local matter. Whatever signals Holly had recreated held real weight heavy enough to draw the attention of cryptographic specialists. Holly backed up until her shoulders touched the wooden wall. The tower felt smaller now, the air pressing in around her. She had no desire to be the center of this sudden storm. She only wanted to feel close to her brother again, to remember him in a way that made sense, to hold onto the fragments of their brief memories. Instead, she had stepped into a hidden conflict she barely understood. Outside, the fog shifted once more, thinning at its edges, as if retreating from the tension gathering inside the tower. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below carried up through the wooden floorboards, pulsing in slow, steady intervals, like an unseen heartbeat. It reminded Holly of the nights she and Caleb listened to the ocean together, sitting on the dunes until the stars came out. The first officer opened the tower's narrow window and looked out. He scanned the coastline, searching for any suspicious movement. Nothing but fog and empty shoreline. Yet he could not shake the eerie coincidence. A young girl drawing classified codes and U-boat patterns shifting in ways that aligned with her symbols. He shut the window and turned back to the room. The spotters waited. Holly waited. The radio hummed. Minutes later, headlights cut through the fog below the tower. A black Navy vehicle approached, stopping at the base of the stairs. The officers stiffened instinctively. Two men stepped out, both wearing plain dark coats and carrying leather briefcases. They climbed the wooden steps with purpose, each footfall measured and precise. The door opened. The taller man scanned the room with sharp, hawk-like eyes, taking in the chalk, the symbols, the paper, the girl. The shorter man carried a folder marked with a red stripe, classified materials. The tall man asked for the logbook. The spotters handed it over without hesitation. He flipped through it quickly, barely glancing at each page before turning to Holly. He asked her to sit at the table. She obeyed, though her pulse hammered in her ears. He asked her if she understood the meaning of the marks she had drawn. She told him no. He asked her to draw more. She did. When she finished, the tall man looked down at the page, and his jaw tightened. He told the others he had seen these markings before, not in training manuals, not in captured enemy documents, but on charts recovered from the wreckage of Caleb's ship. Holly froze. For the first time, the tower fell silent not from suspense, but from something deeper, a sudden awareness that her brother's death might not have been a simple tragedy of war. The tall man explained that the convoy Caleb's ship escorted had been tracked for days before the attack, that someone had identified their position with inexplicable accuracy, that symbols similar to Holly's had been found on debris washed ashore weeks after the sinking. The room darkened with implication. Not sabotage, not espionage, but something more subtle. Navigation patterns the U-boats relied upon, unknowingly revealed by their own predictable cycles. And Holly, through memory alone, had mapped pieces of the system. The tall man folded the paper, slid it into his briefcase, and said they needed to move quickly. The Navy would want to see her findings. And her memory. Night fell over Cape Charles with an unsettling swiftness, the fog thinning just enough to reveal a faint shimmer of moonlight brushing across the Atlantic's restless surface. The Navy vehicle carrying Holly Jensen moved along the coastal road toward Norfolk Naval Station, headlights slicing through the darkness in sharp white beams. Holly sat in the back seat, her small hands folded around the battered chalk box resting in her lap. She felt the rumble of the engine beneath her, a low, steady vibration that only deepened the weight pressing on her chest. The taller intelligence officer sat beside her, silent, his expression fixed on the road ahead. The shorter man sat in the front seat, reviewing her drawings under the glow of a small flashlight. Every so often he whispered something to the driver, his words carried forward in clipped, urgent tones. Holly could not make out what they were saying, but she felt the shift in the air, the sense that she had crossed a line she never meant to approach, pulled suddenly from the narrow world of a grieving little sister into the machinery of a war she barely understood. At the naval station, the vehicle rolled through the gates and into a dimly lit complex of administrative buildings. Sailors moved briskly along the sidewalks, their shadows stretching across the pavement beneath the tall lamps. The officers led Holly inside a small intelligence office filled with filing cabinets, map tables, and telegraph equipment. The hum of activity was constant, underscored by the persistent clicking of typewriters and the soft buzz of radio static. They brought Holly to a table in the corner. A young cryptographer placed a thin stack of photographs in front of her, images of debris taken after Caleb's ship sank, torn pieces of metal, fragments of life jackets, and on one piece of driftwood, faint chalk-like markings weathered by the sea. Holly leaned closer, her breath catching as she recognized the shapes. Her symbols. Caleb's symbols. The very same ones she drew behind the barn, thinking they were nothing more than a private game. The cryptographer explained that these markings had puzzled analysts for months. They matched neither known U-boat codes nor standard Allied communication. No one could trace their source. But when combined with Holly's drawings from earlier that day, a pattern revealed itself. One that suggested the U-boat's surfacing cycles had a far more predictable structure than previously believed. The taller intelligence officer stepped forward, pointing at the photographs and the chalk drawings laid side by side. He said that German submarines, strained by long patrols and mechanical wear, had begun surfacing at increasingly regular intervals to recharge batteries. Their vulnerability, once only a fleeting opportunity, could now be anticipated if the timing sequences were understood. Holly's memory, shaped by Caleb's private lessons, had unknowingly provided the missing key. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications. What Holly learned as a game, an innocent imitation of her brother's world, could be used to form a predictive system capable of intercepting U-boats before they recovered enough power to dive again. A rhythm of war hidden in chalk lines, now exposed by a girl who had only wanted to remember someone she loved. An older officer stepped into the room, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp. He introduced himself as Commander Harland, head of a small operations group focused on submarine interception. He approached Holly with calm, measured steps, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and respect rarely shown to someone her age. He asked her to draw every symbol she remembered, even if it seemed unimportant. Holly nodded slowly. She opened the chalk box with trembling fingers and began drawing one shape after another on the long sheet of dark paper. The cryptographer slid toward her. The room watched in silence as the symbols unfolded in a sequence that seemed chaotic at first, but grew increasingly deliberate as she continued. When she finished, the commander examined the sheet carefully, tracing his finger along each mark. He turned toward the team and said that Holly's sequence, when placed over existing submarine movement charts, formed a map of vulnerabilities. The intervals when U-boats rose to shallow depth with their engines straining, the moments when Allied planes could strike before they dove again. Her drawings exposed the heartbeat of enemy movement. Within hours, the team began constructing a full operational plan. Using her symbols as a guide, they drafted routes for patrol bombers, repositioning them along lines where U-boats were most likely to surface. They redirected convoys, using Holly's memory as a shield, and they prepared a series of countermeasures that would place pressure on the U-boats in ways the enemy could not anticipate. For the first time, Holly realized her drawings had power, real power. Not the kind she wanted, not the kind she sought, but the kind that could save lives. Commander Harlan thanked her quietly, assuring her that her brother's memory had given them something invaluable. He told her that some contributions to war came from unexpected places, and sometimes from those the world overlooked. Holly stared down at the chalk in her hands, unsure whether to feel pride, fear, or something heavier. A realization that the lines she drew to feel close to Caleb might now change the course of the very war that had taken him. In the weeks that followed, patrol bombers intercepted 3 U-boats mid-cycle, catching them exposed on the surface with nowhere to hide. Naval analysts used her patterns to refine their models, outlining the predictable weaknesses in U-boat operations that had gone unnoticed for too long. Sailors returning from missions whispered stories in the barracks about strange timing predictions that seemed almost supernatural. No one knew the truth, except for the small group in the Norfolk Intelligence Office. And Holly, she returned home quietly, carrying the weight of secrets she was forbidden to share. The lighthouse road appeared unchanged, the cracked concrete, the distant waves, the lingering fog. But Holly had changed. She walked slower now, chalk box tucked carefully in her pocket, aware of the invisible line she had crossed forever. Sometimes she drew in the sand still, but only simple things now. Flowers, stars, the shape of a cat. Never symbols, never the lines that mirrored the ocean's hidden war. She missed Caleb terribly, but she understood now that memory carried responsibility. A month later, an unmarked envelope appeared on her doorstep. Inside was a folded paper bearing only a single sentence written in careful pen strokes. 3 ships saved this week because of your brother's lessons. She sat on the porch for a long time holding the letter, listening to the distant murmur of the sea. Her chalk drawings had not stopped the war, but they had shifted the tide along one small stretch of coastline. Somewhere far out in the Atlantic, beneath dark waves and silent depths, U-boat crews wondered how the Americans always seemed to know when they surfaced, how their shadows were being traced by an invisible hand. They would never imagine that the hand belonged to a girl kneeling on a beach road, drawing the fading memories of her brother with a single stick of chalk. And in the quiet nights when the fog crept over Cape Charles again, Holly would sometimes look toward the water, imagining Caleb out there somewhere, watching the seas he once knew so well. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to how even the smallest actions can shift the course of history, then please share this video, like it, and subscribe to WWII Never Told German Files. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment, and it means a lot to know how far these forgotten stories travel.